Mark had hoped things would settle down after the chaos with Karen and her HOA goons, but it wasn't that simple. His life, once calm and predictable, now felt like a quiet storm waiting to hit. The days were the same: sunset strolls in his backyard, mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch. But the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the air. Mark would catch himself glancing over his shoulder, feeling eyes on him even when no one was around. The neighbors had changed too. At first he hadn't noticed, but the subtle shifts in their behavior became more obvious over time. Conversations that used to be friendly now seemed distant, as if they were all keeping some secret. He would wave to Mrs. Johnson across the street, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes anymore. And the Smiths, once so open and talkative, now gave Mark quick nods when they passed, as if afraid to engage. It wasn't that they were outright cold, but there was a thick, unspoken tension, a palpable unease that had settled over the whole neighborhood like a fog. Mark couldn't blame them. After all, how could anyone feel comfortable knowing that an entire underground operation had been running right under their noses? The HOA, the so-called perfect neighborhood enforcers, weren't just about petty rules. They were entangled in something far darker. But what exactly? That was the question Mark couldn't shake. He couldn't stop wondering just how deep Karen's criminal ties went, and if she had others in the neighborhood involved. He had heard rumors, whispers of strange activities. Neighbors who'd been too quiet, but none of it added up. The more he thought about it, the more his mind spiraled. Was it possible that someone here, someone he saw every day, had known about it? Or worse, were they still part of it? The paranoia was creeping in now, settling like a shadow over his every move. Mark had been the one to expose the truth, but at what cost? He tried to push the feeling away, telling himself that things were safe, that Karen was dealt with. But something inside him nagged at him. The ATF had gotten involved, yes, but what if they hadn't uncovered everything? The whole situation felt far from over, and Mark was growing more and more convinced that Karen's network hadn't just disappeared. It was still out there, hiding in the cracks of the neighborhood, watching. He couldn't trust anyone anymore. The more he tried to return to his normal routine, the more he felt like a target. His backyard, once his sanctuary, now seemed like an open space for anyone who might be watching. His neighbors' glances were too quick, their conversations too clipped. Mark kept his distance, walking around the block instead of down the street, avoiding the prying eyes. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. Every car that drove by, every unfamiliar face on the sidewalk, made him uneasy. Was it someone looking for him, or was it just his overactive imagination? It didn't matter. The fear was real, even if the danger wasn't. What troubled Mark the most, though, was the uncertainty. The questions that kept swirling in his mind. What did Karen know? What had she been a part of? How much of it had gone unnoticed for so long? He tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, the idea that somehow someone was still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. The HOA, goons had messed with the wrong person, but what if their influence stretched further than he realized? The more he thought about it, the more questions bubbled up, unanswered and growing with every passing day. Could Karen's reach extend beyond just her HOA tactics? Were there still parts of her empire lurking, waiting to resurface? Mark shook, his head frustrated with himself. He needed to focus, to find a way to push past the fear and get back to some semblance of normal. But the weight of the unknown was heavy. The shadow of Karen, her goons, and everything they'd uncovered still loomed over him. It wasn't just paranoia, it was reality. And it wasn't going away anytime soon. Hey, real quick, if you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. It was a quiet afternoon when Mark first noticed the stranger. At first he thought it was just another passerby, A newcomer, perhaps, someone visiting the neighborhood, but something about him stood out. He was too well dressed for the usual weekend attire in the area, his eyes scanning every house with a practiced, almost unnerving focus. Mark wasn't one to stare, but there was a tension in the air whenever the man walked past. He lingered by the park across from Mark's house, looking around as if he were waiting for something, or someone. It wasn't until the next day that Mark finally learned the truth. The man approached Mark's doorstep with a polite knock that echoed far too loud in the empty air. Mark opened the door, expecting to find a solicitor or maybe an innocent neighbor with some question, but instead, he was met with the stranger's dark, solemn eyes. "Mr. Dawson?" the man asked, his voice steady but low, like he was trying to keep his words from carrying too far. "I'm Agent Thomas, from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. I need to ask you a few questions about your involvement in an ongoing investigation." Mark's heart skipped a beat, and for a moment all he could do was stare. The man didn't look like an agent. He didn't carry the sharp authority Mark had imagined when thinking of law enforcement. Instead, he looked ordinary, almost. Too ordinary. The kind of face you could easily forget after meeting. But there was something about him that didn't sit right. "An investigation?" Mark repeated, his voice tight. "About what exactly?" Agent Thomas glanced behind him, as though making sure no one was within earshot. "We have reason to believe there are individuals still trying to bury the events that occurred here. And it's not just Karen or her HOA network. There's more going on, Mr. Dawson. We need your help to figure out just how deep this runs." Mark's stomach churned. His mind raced, the puzzle pieces from the past few months scattering in all directions. Karen and her HOA goons were bad enough, but now he was being dragged into something even darker, something more complicated than he could have ever imagined. The air felt thick around him, like something was closing in. The agent's presence alone was unsettling, but the weight of his words added another layer of unease. Mark's life had been turned upside down once before, and he'd thought, foolishly, that things might go back to normal. But now, it seemed the nightmare wasn't over. It had only shifted into a different, more dangerous phase. Later that afternoon, as Mark sat alone in his living room, the phone rang. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something told him he wouldn't like what was on the other end. He picked up, his throat dry. "Mr. Dawson?" The voice on the other end was calm, but there was an urgency beneath it. "This is Special Agent Reynolds from the ATF. We need to speak with you about the recent developments in your case. It's crucial that you come in for a follow-up interview." The words hit him like a punch. He had hoped that after Karen's downfall, after everything that had gone down with the HOA, he could finally find some peace. But now here he was, being sucked back into a web of criminal activity he barely understood. And this time, it wasn't just Karen and her goons. This was bigger, more insidious. The questions swirled in his mind. Why was the ATF still involved? Why was he, of all people, being pulled back in? Was he helping them, or was he just another pawn in a much larger game? And if there were still people out there who wanted to keep the truth hidden, what lengths would they go to in order to silence him? As the days passed, Mark's paranoia grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. At night, the quiet hum of his neighborhood felt more oppressive, as though there were eyes in the shadows, waiting for him to slip up. There was no escaping the fact that his life was becoming more tangled with the investigation. And now, more than ever. It felt like there were forces out there far beyond his control. Mark had tried to return to normalcy, to push past the mess Karen had caused. But now it seemed the consequences of his past encounters were far from over. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And this time, Mark had no idea how deep the rabbit hole went, or how much danger he was really in. The days following his unsettling encounter with Agent Thomas were filled with questions that Mark didn't know how to answer. He had hoped that The aftermath of his ordeal with Karen would bring some sense of closure, but instead, it had opened up a Pandora's box he was unprepared for. The authorities had been vague in their explanations, but each time they contacted him, they made it clearer that there was far more at stake than he had ever imagined. It started with the cryptic phone call from Special Agent Reynolds. "We're uncovering something far deeper than we initially thought," Reynolds had said, his voice tight with tension. "Karen wasn't just an HOA nuisance, Mr. Dawson. She was a cog in something much bigger." Mark had no idea what to make of that. He'd thought the worst of Karen was her overbearing attitude and her constant meddling in his life, but now it was clear that there were dark, dangerous layers beneath the surface. In the days that followed, Mark found himself sitting in yet another meeting with Agent Reynolds, this time in a nondescript office far from his neighborhood. The sterile, almost clinical atmosphere of the room made the whole situation feel even more surreal. Mark sat across from the agent, who wasted no time getting to the point. "We've traced Karen's activities back to an underground network," Reynolds explained, his eyes locked on Mark. "Money laundering, weapons smuggling, trafficking. She was involved in all of it. But what's most disturbing is that she wasn't working alone. There are others, big players, and they're not just operating locally." Mark's mind was spinning. He had a hard time reconciling the image of the woman he had dealt with, the petty, power-hungry HOA Karen, with the criminal mastermind the agent was describing. The idea that she was connected to something so massive was hard to believe, but the grim reality in Reynolds' voice told him otherwise. "They've been using the HOA as a front for years," Reynolds continued, leaning forward. "Her role was to keep eyes on the neighborhood, weed out anyone who might get in their way, and you were the wrong person at the wrong time, Mr. Dawson. They never expected someone to push back." The realization hit Mark like a cold slap to the face. Everything he'd endured, the locked gates, the strange encounters, the hidden threats, had all been part of a much larger operation. Karen wasn't just a neighborhood tyrant. She was a cog in a dangerous criminal enterprise. And now, Mark had unwittingly found himself smack in the middle of it. "Is that why you're still involved?" Mark asked, his voice steady but filled with the kind of frustration that only comes from feeling like you've been manipulated. "Am I part of your investigation now?" Reynolds nodded slowly, his face hardening. "We need you to help us get to the bigger fish. But I'm not going to sugarcoat this, Mr. Dawson. There's danger. People are watching you. Karen's connections go deeper than we can even begin to unravel. And we need your cooperation to bring this down." The weight of Reynolds' words hung heavily in the air, but before Mark could respond, his phone buzzed. The screen displayed an unfamiliar number, but something about the call made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Reluctantly, he answered. "Mark Dawson," the voice on the other end whispered, barely audible. "Stay quiet. Stay out of it. They're still watching you. You don't know how deep this goes. If you value your life, you'll keep your head down." The line went dead before Mark could say anything. His heart was pounding. It wasn't just the authorities who had their eyes on him now. There were other players, other forces, hidden in the shadows, who wanted him to disappear back into his ordinary life, away from the investigation. It was clear that someone didn't want Mark digging any deeper. But what bothered him more was the sense of being trapped. He couldn't back down now. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but he was beginning to realize that uncovering the truth might be more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. As the days passed, Mark's sense of unease only grew. The messages kept coming, cryptic warnings, threats veiled as advice. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the authorities who claimed they had his best interests at heart. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. He had become a pawn in a game far bigger than him, with no clear way out. And worse, he had no idea how many others were involved or what they were willing to do to protect their secrets. The deeper Mark dug into Karen's connections, the more unsettling the truth became. This wasn't just about a neighborhood feud. or an HOA's overreach. It was about something far more sinister, something that threatened everything Mark thought he knew about the people around him. And if he wasn't careful, it could cost him more than just his peace of mind. It could cost him his life. It was late afternoon when Mark first saw him, a man standing in the shadows of his driveway, his hands stuffed into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. The figure looked out of place in the quiet suburban neighborhood, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings with the alertness of someone who was used to being watched. Mark's first instinct was to walk the other way, but something in the man's stance, something about the way he was waiting, kept him from turning back. "Mark Dawson?" The stranger called out, his voice low but firm. Mark's gut tightened. He wasn't in the habit of talking to strangers, especially not after everything that had happened with Karen and the trouble that had followed. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter might be more than just a random meeting. "Who are you?" Mark asked cautiously, taking a step back. The man's lips curled into a tight smile. "I think we might have a mutual interest in Karen. Mind if I talk to you for a second?" Mark hesitated, his mind racing. What could this guy possibly want with him? He had enough problems without adding more unknowns into the mix, but his curiosity won out. "What do you want with me?" "I've got information," the man said, his eyes darting to the street. "Information about Karen's operations, things she's been hiding from everyone." Mark's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to ask for more details, but he quickly reminded himself that the world he'd been dragged into wasn't one where trust came easy. Still, this was the kind of lead he'd been hoping for, wasn't it? "Why come to me?" Mark asked, squinting at the man. "What do you get out of this?" The man sighed, stepping forward slightly. "I've been trying to take Karen down for years. She's destroyed more lives than you can imagine. I've got my own reasons for wanting to make sure she's held accountable, but I'm not doing this alone. I'm offering you the chance to take down the rest of her network, but I need your help." Mark's pulse quickened. The offer was tempting, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After everything that had happened, he couldn't afford to be naive. "And what do you get out of it?" The man's expression hardened. "Satisfaction. She's hurt too many people, and I've spent too long watching her get away with it. If we don't do this now, her connections will just keep growing. She'll keep pulling strings from behind the scenes, ruining more lives. You know that, as well as I do." Mark thought back to everything he'd learned about Karen's criminal empire, everything Agent Reynolds had said about the weapons, the smuggling, the underground operations. He didn't need any more convincing. The problem was deciding whether he could trust this man. There was no doubt in his mind that Karen had a long reach. If this guy wasn't on the level, he could easily be a part of her network, someone sent to manipulate him. "I don't know if I can trust you," Mark admitted, his voice tense. "How do I know you're not working for her?" The man's eyes softened, and for a brief moment Mark saw a flicker of something, regret, maybe, or frustration. "Because I've lost people to her, people I cared about. This isn't some vendetta or power play. This is about putting an end to something that's been hurting people for too long." Mark's instincts told him to be cautious, to walk away from this before it escalated further. But there was something in the man's tone, something raw and sincere, that made Mark hesitate. "All right," Mark said finally, his voice steady. "What's your plan?" The man looked around one more time before speaking. "We'll need to move fast. I can give you the names of the people who are still working with Karen, the ones that haven't been exposed yet. But be warned, they won't go down easily. They've been operating in the shadows for years, and they won't just let you take them out. It's dangerous, but it's the only chance we have to finish what Karen started." Mark swallowed hard. This wasn't just about getting his life back to normal anymore. This was about exposing a criminal network, a hidden world that had been under his nose the entire time. The twist came when the man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But you need to know one thing. I've got a personal stake in this. Karen did something to me, Something unforgivable. This isn't just about justice, it's about revenge. Mark froze. The weight of the words hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just some dispassionate ally. This man had his own demons, his own reasons for wanting Karen gone. And that made him more dangerous and more unpredictable than Mark had anticipated. The stakes had just gotten a whole lot higher. "So, what do you say?" the man asked, his eyes intense. "Are you in?" Mark stared at him for a long moment, his mind swirling with conflicting thoughts. Could he trust this person? Or was he just being drawn deeper into a web of lies and manipulation? Either way, there was no turning back now. The path ahead was risky, and the consequences of failure were clear. "I'm in," Mark said, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "Let's take her down." Little did he know, this unexpected alliance would set the stage for a dangerous game of cat and mouse, where every move mattered, and every decision could mean life or death. The weight of the situation was starting to settle in. As Mark worked alongside the authorities and the informant, trying to piece together the threads of Karen's criminal network, something didn't feel right. The investigation, which had once seemed like a straightforward attempt to dismantle a small-time operation, was now revealing cracks, dark, dangerous cracks, that suggested something much bigger was at play. It wasn't just the shadowy whispers of people within Karen's circle. It was the feeling of being watched. Every time Mark went out, he couldn't shake the sensation that eyes were on him. Unmarked cars parked too long on the corner of his street, their occupants staring at his house before pulling away just as he stepped outside. At first he chalked it up to coincidence, maybe some overactive imagination. But it kept happening, and Mark wasn't the kind of person to ignore his instincts. Then, one morning, the first of the mysterious phone calls came. It was early, just as the sun was rising, casting a pale glow over the neighborhood. The voice on the other end was garbled, distorted, as if someone was trying to conceal their identity. "You think you're safe, but you're not," the voice hissed before abruptly hanging up. Mark stood frozen for a moment, staring at his phone, the weight of the words pressing down on him. His mind raced. Was it one of Karen's people? The network they were uncovering was vast, and the idea that someone powerful was still pulling the strings only added to the growing unease. Someone didn't want the investigation to succeed, and they were willing to go to great lengths to ensure it failed. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he set the phone down on the kitchen counter, the silence in the house now feeling oppressive. The incidents grew more frequent. He'd see unfamiliar faces walking past his house, their glances too lingering to be innocent. On one evening, as he sat in his living room, he noticed a man on the other side of the street. The man appeared to be fiddling with a car in the driveway across from his, but Mark could sense something off. The man wasn't working on the car. He was watching Mark's house, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the man disappeared, around the corner. By now Mark was certain. Someone or something was watching his every move. But who? And why? Days passed with little more than unsettling experiences, until one late evening, after a long day of meeting with agents, Mark's phone buzzed with a message. It wasn't from the informant or anyone else he was working with. The message simply read, "You're not alone in this. Keep your head down, stay quiet, and keep moving. You're being watched." The message was anonymous. No signature, no return number. Just a cold warning. His heart raced as the familiar sense of paranoia gnawed at him. Who was this? Was it a threat from someone in Karen's organization? Or was it a sign that his every step was being tracked by forces even more dangerous than he had imagined? Later that night, the paranoia intensified. Mark was in his backyard, standing by the fence and staring out into the quiet neighborhood, when he heard the distinct sound of footsteps. He turned, expecting to see a neighbor, or maybe someone walking a dog, but the street was empty. And yet, the feeling of being watched was undeniable. He made his way toward his back door, But as he passed the garage, he froze. A shadow moved across the driveway, quick and deliberate. Someone was there. Mark's pulse quickened. He rushed to the door, locking it behind him. He wasn't sure who was out there, but he knew that they were watching him. The unknown person, or people, had come too close this time. In the coming days, things only escalated. His car was tampered with, his tires slashed, and a darkened figure was seen lurking in his driveway. He began finding strange symbols, cryptic and menacing, scrawled on pieces of paper left on his doorstep. The message was clear. Someone didn't want him getting too close to the truth. One evening, as Mark reviewed his notes in the dim light of his living room, his phone rang again. This time, the voice was clearer, more direct. "We know what you're doing, and we're not going to let you interfere. You're in way over your head, Mark." The call ended with the same ominous click, leaving Mark with a pit in his stomach. Was this the work of Karen's remaining associates? Or was there someone else, entirely behind it all? The more Mark thought about it, the more certain he became. The forces working against him were not just those loyal to Karen. Someone else, someone far more powerful, was manipulating the situation from the shadows. Mark's role in this increasingly dangerous game had shifted. No longer just a participant in the investigation, he was now a pawn in a much larger chess game. The authorities had their hands full, and Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was being drawn into something deeper, something far more sinister than anyone had realized. He sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. His only option now was to stay one step ahead of the forces pulling the strings. If he didn't, he might not make it out of this alive. As the phone remained silent, Mark knew he had just entered a new phase of this battle, a phase where the true enemy remained, unseen. Mark stood at the edge of a precipice, staring into the uncertainty that lay before him. The days of creeping suspicion, cryptic messages, and shadowy figures had brought him to this moment. A moment where every decision would either pull him deeper into a web of danger or offer him a chance to step away from it all. The stakes had never been higher. His phone buzzed again, but this time he didn't feel the urge to check it immediately. The messages, the threats, the warnings, they were all blurring together now, like a dissonant soundtrack to a life he never intended to live. Mark had always been a man who valued control, who could handle the chaos of legal battles, community disputes, and the petty squabbles of his neighbors. But now he was entangled in something much darker, something that seemed to have roots, stretching far beyond Karen's antics. He leaned against his kitchen counter, the hum of his refrigerator the only sound in the room. The more he dug into Karen's past, the more disturbing truths came to light. The HOA was more than just an overzealous group of neighbors trying to enforce their petty rules. It was a front. Behind the veneer of lawn care edicts and paint color, Disputes was an underground network of criminals, and Karen was their linchpin. The small-time operations he'd thought were behind him turned out to be connected to money laundering, arms trafficking, and even ties to corrupt law enforcement officers who had turned a blind eye to it all. The further he went down this path, the more entangled he became. Documents he found, hidden in plain sight, disguised as routine HOA paperwork, led to shady backdoor deals involving local businesses, unmarked cash exchanges, and mysterious third-party figures whose names Mark didn't even recognize. But the one thing that stood out the most? The connection between the law enforcement officers who had ignored the blatant illegal activities of the HOA and Karen's criminal empire. He wasn't just dealing with a few rogue individuals. This was systemic corruption, a network of power that reached into the very fabric of his community, all the way up to the highest levels of local government. The realization hit him like a freight train. There were people out there, people with far more to lose than Karen, who wanted to keep this all buried. They would stop at nothing to ensure that the investigation never reached the light of day. As Mark pieced it together, his heart raced. He couldn't shake the thought that he was now at the center of a conspiracy much larger than he had ever imagined. The authorities were only beginning to scratch the surface, but Mark knew what he had found would send shockwaves through the entire community and beyond. His small town, which once seemed so ordinary, was now a backdrop for a much larger game of power, crime, and manipulation. But now, as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Mark had to face the harsh truth. He was running out of time. The mysterious figure watching his every move was no longer just an abstract threat. Someone was actively trying to silence him, and as much as he wanted to step back and wash his hands of it all, he couldn't. Not anymore. The weight of the decision was suffocating. Mark had always prided himself on making the right call, on seeing things through. But this? This was no longer just about him. His safety was on the line, sure, but so was the future of the investigation, the future of the town, and maybe even the lives of others who had no idea they were living under the shadow of Karen's empire. The knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He wasn't expecting anyone. His mind raced. Could it be someone trying to threaten him? Or worse, could it be someone who had come to silence him once and for all? Mark cautiously approached the door, his hand hovering over the handle. A quick glance through the peephole revealed nothing but the stillness of the night. But he wasn't fooled. The pressure was mounting, and he could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just a fight for justice anymore. It was a battle for his survival. As he opened the door, the figure standing on the other side wasn't who he expected. It was a woman he recognized from the investigation. She was calm, her expression unreadable. She didn't speak. Right away. She just handed him a piece of paper, folded neatly in half. Mark opened it, his eyes scanning the contents quickly. A name, an address, a time, a final warning. "Don't make a move," the woman said simply, her voice quiet but firm. "Not unless you're ready for what's coming next." The door clicked shut behind her before Mark could respond, and the silence that followed felt like a noose tightening around his neck. He had a choice to make: stay and keep digging, or walk away from it all. But he knew, deep down, that there was no going back now. He was too far in, and the truth was out of his reach, just beyond his grasp. A confrontation loomed closer than ever. The pieces were all in place. Mark was ready to make his move, but with the stakes so high, the cost of failure was unimaginable. As the clock ticked, Mark knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just fighting Karen anymore. He was up against an entire network, a force so deep-rooted in his town's fabric that exposing it could unravel everything. And if he wasn't careful, he might lose more than just his peace of mind. He might lose everything. The sun had barely begun to rise, but Mark was already sitting at his kitchen table, a stack of papers and files scattered in front of him. The quiet was unsettling, the stillness oppressive. As he sifted through the documents, his mind couldn't shake the sense that he was on the verge of something massive, something that would either free him from the nightmare or drag him even deeper into it. His phone buzzed again, the message, on the screen, cold and direct. "It's not just about the HOA." Mark read the words over and over, but they made no sense at first. Not just about the HOA? What did that even mean? He tossed the phone aside, frustration bubbling to the surface. Karen's obsession with controlling the neighborhood had always seemed to be about power, about being the queen of her little kingdom. But now, after everything he had uncovered, Mark was beginning to understand that the truth was far darker. The doorbell rang, cutting through his thoughts like a knife. He hesitated before getting up, a growing sense of dread gnawing at him. It could be anyone. Another visit from the mysterious informant, maybe even someone trying to finish what Karen had started. But when Mark opened the door, the person standing there wasn't who he expected. It was the same woman who had given him the cryptic warning the night before. Her expression was grim, her eyes scanning the area as if she expected someone to jump out from behind the bushes. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but urgent. Mark stepped aside, allowing her into the house. The silence between them was thick with anticipation. He closed the door behind her and motioned to the kitchen table, where the evidence was laid out like a crime scene. She didn't sit, but instead her eyes swept over the papers, pausing on certain documents as if she was deciding how much to reveal. "Karen's obsession with the HOA," she began, her voice steady. "It's not just about controlling the neighborhood. Not anymore. It's about something far more personal. Something you never saw coming." Mark froze. He had thought the worst of Karen's motivations: power, control, greed. But now it felt like the ground beneath him was crumbling. "She was protecting something," the woman continued, her eyes narrowing as she finally turned to face him. "Something much bigger than the HOA itself. You've seen the connections to the criminal activity, the money laundering, the weapons smuggling. But what you haven't seen is the reason behind it all." Mark felt his pulse quicken, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He leaned forward. "What are you talking about?" The woman hesitated, as if weighing her next words. Carefully. "Karen's family," she finally said, her tone laced with bitterness. Her father was part of a criminal empire that spanned generations. But it wasn't just about money or power. It was about legacy. Karen inherited everything he built. But when he died, it all started to crumble. She was forced to take control, but she knew she couldn't do it alone. So she turned to the HOA. It became her shield, a way to control her turf. She built that empire from the ground up, using the HOA as her front, as her armor. It's all connected. Everything she's done was about maintaining that control. The revelation hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Karen's obsession with the neighborhood wasn't just a personal vendetta or an insane power trip. It was about survival. She had used the HOA as a tool to protect her family's criminal empire, to keep a lid on the dangerous world she was part of. The more Mark thought about it, the more it made sense. Every move Karen had made, every subtle manipulation of the neighborhood, had been part of a calculated effort to preserve her empire. And the weapons, the illegal activities, it was all part of a larger scheme to maintain her power and keep her family's dark legacy intact. Mark's thoughts raced as he pieced everything together. He realized now that the fight wasn't just about exposing Karen or even taking down the HOA. It was about surviving a confrontation with forces far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. The pieces were coming together, but it wasn't just Karen's empire he had to worry about anymore. It was the entire criminal network she had built, the network that was still alive and active, operating in the shadows. His mind shifted to the authorities. He had been working with them, following their lead, but now he knew the truth. He couldn't trust them completely. Some of them were compromised, connected to Karen's empire in ways he hadn't understood before. He needed to take matters into his own hands if he wanted to clear his name and protect his future. Mark took a deep breath, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being able to think several steps ahead. But this was different. This wasn't just a neighborhood dispute or a personal vendetta. This was a battle for his life, and he knew that if he didn't act fast, he might lose everything. "I have to confront her," Mark said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The woman nodded, her expression unreadable. "You're not alone in this, but you need to be careful. They're watching, every step you take." Mark's pulse raced as he realized just how much danger he was in. But he knew there was no turning back. The revelation about Karen's past had changed everything. He couldn't just walk away anymore. His future, his safety, depended on taking down the criminal empire Karen had built, and he was ready to make the final move. The day of the final showdown had arrived, and Mark felt a strange mix of adrenaline and dread coursing through him. He had spent the past few weeks learning about Karen's twisted web of lies and criminal connections, and now it all led to this. The stakes had never been higher. The quiet neighborhood he had once called home was about to erupt in chaos. And at the center of it all was Karen, the woman who had turned his life upside down. Mark's phone buzzed again. An encrypted message from the mysterious informant. "It's happening tonight. Everything you've learned, everything you've planned, it all comes together now." He didn't respond. His mind was too focused, too determined. He had learned a lot in the last few days, about Karen, about the dark forces at play, and about the fragile nature of his own safety. Now it was time to act. The authorities were closing in, but Mark knew they needed him to pull the final pieces into place. The first wave of action came when a convoy of unmarked vehicles rolled down the street, their engines low and steady. Mark recognized some of the officers from previous meetings, but others were new, federal agents with grim faces and no patience for delay. They had no idea what they were walking into. Mark watched them through the window, his heart thumping in his chest. He'd been playing this game for weeks, each move carefully calculated. But now, standing on the precipice of it all, it was hard to ignore the fear gnawing at him. If Karen had truly thought she could control everything, she was about to be proven wrong. He had the power now, he just needed to use it wisely. As Mark walked out onto the porch, he saw Karen's car parked at the end of the street. His pulse quickened. This was it. She had to know the walls were closing in on her, but she was too arrogant, too confident in her power to back down. She was coming to finish what she'd started. But this time, Mark wouldn't be the pawn. He would be the one calling the shots. Karen's cold eyes locked onto his as she stepped out of her car. For a moment, everything seemed suspended in time. The street, the distant sound of the agents preparing, even the air itself. It was just Mark and Karen facing each other for the final time. "So this is it," she said, her voice a mixture of defiance and bitterness. "You think you've won?" Mark didn't respond immediately. He'd spent too much time learning about her fragile empire, and now he could see the cracks in her armor. She was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. "I'm not here to win, Karen," Mark finally said, his voice calm but steady. "I'm here to end this. To end you." Behind him, the authorities moved in, their presence turning the quiet neighborhood into a scene straight out of a crime drama. Karen's expression faltered for a split second, but she quickly regained her composure, her hand resting on the door handle of her car. "You don't know who you're dealing with," she spat, but the venom in her words couldn't mask the fear beneath it. Mark could see it now, the fear in her eyes. She wasn't as confident as she'd led everyone to believe. The woman who had ruled the HOA with an iron fist was about to be brought to her knees. The agents closed in, and Karen tried to make a run for it, but it was too late. They were already on her, pulling her away from the car and cuffing her hands behind her back. She struggled, shouting curses, but it was no use. Her empire had crumbled. The atmosphere was thick with the tension of years of secrecy unraveling in an instant. As the agents hauled her into the back of an unmarked van, Mark stood still, watching her go. It was over, but even as the authorities began their cleanup, arresting those who had been working with Karen, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had been irrevocably changed. In the days that followed, the neighborhood began to return to normal, or at least as close to normal as it could. The cars that had once been parked suspiciously on street corners disappeared. The whispers in the neighborhood became less frequent. People were free from the grip of the HOA, but there was still an unspoken tension in the air. The scars of the past few months would never fade completely. Mark couldn't help but reflect on the strange path his life had taken. From the moment the HOA had first tried to push him out of his own home, he had been thrust into a world of shadows and danger he had never expected. What started as a petty dispute over property lines had spiraled into a dangerous game of cat and mouse, filled with criminals, lies, and dark secrets. Now, as he stood in his quiet home, the weight of the past few months on his shoulders, Mark wondered if things would ever feel truly safe again. He had taken down Karen, but there was a part of him that knew this wasn't the end. The people behind her, the ones who had orchestrated everything from the shadows, they were still out there, watching, waiting. But for now, Mark had won. Karen was in custody, and the authorities were clearing up the mess she'd left behind. His neighborhood was quiet again, and for the first time in months, Mark felt like he could breathe without the constant fear of what might happen next. It was bittersweet. The victory felt hollow, like the calm before another storm. But in that moment, Mark allowed himself a small sense of satisfaction. He had outsmarted those who tried to use him, and in the end, he had protected the one thing that mattered most, his home. And with that, he walked away, knowing that whatever the future held, he had survived. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.